Hi everyone. I had a little bit of time in between the final proofreading for the Demon module of my Sex Positivity book series, so I thought I'd do another video watching something on YouTube and just responding to it. And I didn't really feel like going over or reading anything that I had written, so I didn't want to do a Metroidvania video. Instead, what I thought I would do is another like bodybuilding sort of response video and thinking about like physical fitness and stuff like that. And even though I'm a trans woman and I don't identify as a man, um, physical fitness is something that interests me, and the idea of bodybuilding as a history and a lot of the problems that surround it currently within the world as it exists presently are of interest to me, because I think there's a lot of problems tied not just to the health of the human body as advertised through bodybuilding, but also like the body image of the male bodybuilder in particular, though dimorphically speaking and under heteronormativity at large, men and women, just cisgendered men and women, and the roles that they're expected to play, and the Vitruvian sort of model, the Nordic model that they're supposed to have in terms of their bodies, and all of the cultural values that come attached to that, and everything that's abjected off of that, that is alien or other relative to those models. Like there's so many different things to consider regarding that. But I thought what we would do is I found a video from a channel that I like, and it's Golden Bodybuilding Fitness, I believe. Let me double check. The Golden Era Bookworm is the video author, and the title of the video is "It's Official, Bodybuilders Have Been Dying Earlier Since the Golden Era. Hashtag bodybuilding, hashtag health." So I thought we'd watch that. I started to watch it and I got about halfway through it, and then I thought, okay, well, why didn't I make a little video about this? So yeah, that's the point of the video. And basically it's about 15 minutes long. And so we'll just sort of watch it and pause in between the video, just starting and stopping if I feel like I have anything to say. And we'll just go from start to finish. So before we begin real quick, I want to say that, again, I really do like Golden Era Bookworm. They're more academically oriented, but they also have a pretty extensive book collection, and they're very thorough in terms of like their historical research. So not only do they do the physical exercises in a way that's like vintage, and they also have a lot of scholarship that they've collected like physically. So they have, an actual book shelf with books on it, and they also work with people academically. Though something that they mentioned in this video is that a lot of academia surrounding bodybuilding has been ignoring the health crisis, which is an interesting thing to note, insofar as academia is not immune to neoliberalism and deregulation and the incentives of accommodating intellectuals to basically pay them hush money or give them certain privileges and statuses to keep quiet about certain things tied to the aforementioned Nordic model and Vitruvian body, and just white supremacy and various bigotries like misogyny and racism and queerphobia at large. And there's just all kinds of negative things that are attached to that. So this particular video is kind of addressing that in a way that's sort of calling out academia in particular. And when they say academia, I don't think they mean the medical profession necessarily, though the medical profession is certainly, especially within America, also turning a blind eye, but I think more like academia in terms of just scholarship more broadly, which probably includes history, which is something that they specialize in. I'll have to watch the whole video to see exactly what they mean by that if they clarify it, but they do call out academia more broadly. So that includes the STEM fields, but also just uh, any aspect of it, the humanities as well, I would imagine. Um, they also have hashtag bodybuilding and health. And in regards to the last video that I did, where I talked about Solomon Nelson, and there's a particular guest who's on Solomon Nelson as well, Lyle McDonald, uh, who essentially mentioned that bodybuilding isn't about health, it's about cultivating specific images, I would argue, of power and status tied to capital. So the more you look like Eugene Sandow, basically, and his idea of an imaginary antiquity, which is fascist, white supremacist, and everything that goes along with that, um, the more status you have, and this includes like bro points, but those bro points are something that is awarded by capital, because capital from America outwards under Pax Americana is something that historically awards people who look a particular way. If you and that's not just capital, the system, and the bourgeoisie, but also just people in society. The cultural heroes, ontological or not, Superman, and any superhero you could think of besides Superman, like Batman or Cyclops from X-Men, Wolverine, and just really anyone else from Marvel Rivals or Overwatch or any comic book in Marvel or DC, Frank Frazetta, Leonardo da Vinci and the Vitruvian model, a lot of things like that. Though obviously in Da Vinci's day, that was like during the Renaissance and mercantile capitalism, after the Black Death, and it was before Christopher Columbus and the rise of settler colonialism. So the racist characters weren't quite there the way that they exist now. But that model was certainly co-opted in ways that are awarded not just again by the bourgeoisie, but also by people around you. You know, a lot of people are conditioned since birth through popular stories, from comic books to movies and various other monomythic stories that convey cultural values tied to people who have a particular look. So police officers, for instance, Ronnie Coleman was an 8-time Mr. Olympia who was a police officer, and he basically followed a particular body model that looked very statuesque. So the idea the protectors of society are basically whitewashed, or Tolkien in Ronnie Coleman's case, Greek or Greco-Roman statues, and with all the cultural values tied to that. And imagine like any sort of state building that you've seen has that sort of Greco-Roman pantheon, marble pillars look to it, and that Western hauntology is attached to, if you look like a Greek god, hauntologically speaking, you will be treated like one. And this includes, cash incentives and status in terms of positions within capital, but also just like people on the street will see you and they're like, whoa, dude, you totally look like Achilles, or you look like Hercules, or these days people would probably be more like, you look like a particular celebrity who plays a superhero. So someone might be like, man, you totally look like Chris Hemsworth, or you look like Chris Bumstead if somebody follows bodybuilding. But stage actors, specifically actors in Marvel movies, are imitating that same model. So a lot of times, though, depending on what people consume and what they watch more idiosyncratically, someone would look at something and be like, wow, you totally look like the actor who plays someone who looks statuesque. But they have a trainer, they eat a specific kind of diet, and they're on a lot of drugs, usually, or enough drugs to have they're genetically modified. So it's very Frankensteinian, right? And the profit motive tied to a ontological body model is genetically modified, like from a eugenics standpoint, to uphold white supremacy and all of these different cultural values tied to the aforementioned motive and the ontology associated with it. Like there's a lot of things like that. Golden Era Bookworm doesn't really mention any of this, but I wanted to mention that because the reason that bodybuilding and health aren't really tied to each other is because profit doesn't care about health. It cares about exploiting nature, and that includes the so-called benefactors of bodybuilding, white cishet men first and foremost, and then branching out to other genders and ethnic groups and marginalized groups that tokenize to a certain extent, that have the money and status to even do something like bodybuilding, because basically you have to have enough money and equipment to get yourself big enough to then sculpt yourself like a statue, which is to say, starve yourself, as Lyle McDonald would say. You eat a shitload of food, and then after that, you basically starve yourself. And a lot of people will use various drug-induced effects like insulin and diuretics and various other things to get as shredded as possible. So not only are they starving themselves, but they're doing other things that get them to look a very particular statuesque way, because the more they can do that, the more they can tap into that sort of Promethean power center that gives them all of these things, and it's kind of abstract, but it's half real, right? Because it exists between fiction and nonfiction. So the more you look a particular way, the more you'll be treated differently in society. So there's a parasocial component, but there are material effects. There are socio-material effects, and you can get more job opportunities. You can, be approached by people. At least historically, you would be approached to do, I don't know, underwear commercials, or just to work in acting more broadly. Oh, you look like you could be in the movies or something like that. That would happen historically. AI is probably complicating that a little bit, but I would imagine that outside the rise of various issues attached to the tech sector and Silicon Valley and fascism and all of that, just all things, created equal, apart from those very inequitable factors geopolitically and across the board. Obviously that's a whole nother can of worms, but just ignoring that, there are plenty of incentives to looking that way, because there are plenty of people who are coded to respond positively to that sort of patriarchal status quo. And from the ancient imperial world, basically from the city-states of Sparta and Athens and Rome, into the First, Second, and Third Reichs, so the Holy Roman Empire, the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, and America, which Nazi Germany was emulating on top of these older cultures. There's this sort of heroic model. And the idea of that naked, sculpted sort of imaginary antiquity, Eugene Sandow, stuff like that, is very much something that came like from the 1890s into what Golden Era Bookworm here would call the Bronze Era. But it's after the Bronze Era that they make an argument for bodybuilders have been dying earlier since the Golden Era. So I think that's enough sort of pretext and context, what I'm thinking about, even before we go into this and just thinking about bodybuilding and health. But there are some things I want to critique about Golden Era Bookworm. They're generally really solid. They don't, they stress physical fitness and health, and they don't discriminate, they don't segregate, they seem relatively neutral, all things considered, which is generally oftentimes a red flag. But they don't tend to advertise any like unsavory politics. They're literally just like, hey, being healthy is good, anyone can do it, and here's some people you can study insofar as that goes. So they tend to look backwards, not in terms of nostalgia, but literally just, hey, these methods were healthier than the ones since the Golden Era into the mass monster period, and that's totally valid. Though I will say there's still like there are some markers of Western supremacy that I want to point out, especially in the data side of things. Uh, but I don't feel like too critical towards them overall. They're a pretty awesome channel, and they have a lot of like really cool retro stuff that I don't really have time to get into here, but it's just it's just another thing worth mentioning about their channel in particular. They're really cool, and not only are they really cool, but they're also a good historian, and they have a lot of interviews, and so it's not just them, but they have a network of people that they work with, and they also have testimonies from people that they work with, and I guess we could just look real quick here, like Back from the Dead. So they have like muscle magazines and stuff like that, some vintage stuff from like I don't know the 70s and 80s it looks like, but they have a lot of different things, and some of the stuff they have is a little sillier. Arnold talks about orgies to female inmate, and Arnold was definitely kind of a sleazebag in the 80s. I will say he's cleaned up his image, and overall, relative to a lot of bodybuilders, he's actually a class act. He's obviously like a Western liberal overall, maybe a sock dem if we're being charitable, but I guess that's neither here nor there. And he was definitely racist in the past when he was competing against Sergio Oliva, and I forget the guy who put up Arnold and was basically promoting him, but Arnold was definitely a poster boy for the Nordic model, and there's a lot of other stuff like that that I could talk about just looking at the thumbnails, but obviously, Golden Era Bookworm talks about a lot of that stuff. I think it's interesting that he's Golden Era Bookworm because he actually prefers, I think, the Silver and Bronze eras, the way that he classifies them. And he talks about which bodybuilding eras have the greatest longevity. He talks about Arnold and Whiter. I think it was Joe Whiter. Joe Whiter was racist and encouraged Arnold to do it, but Arnold also came from Austria, and I know that he was against the Nazis, but so was my grandfather in Holland, and it didn't stop him from being bigoted too. So, but again, that's I don't know. Enough about that, I guess. But there's all kinds of cool stuff, and it's just a testimony to that. There's all this cool stuff because Golden Era Bookworm covers just frankly a shitload of stuff and stuff that interests me. I'm a trans woman, but I was interested in neoliberalism's effect on the male physique and the male statuesque from the Vitruvian standard onwards under capitalism. And this video, the Golden Era Bookworm is talking about, is super, super germane to that because the effect of this particular model is basically to make yourself into the image of profit. As it's Vince McMahon in the WWE, where he talks about you have this particular face, they care about that, but let's not kid ourselves. A huge part of it is that particular body, but it's just not physically attainable, right? It's the body of the gods, and the body of the gods is something that no mortal man was meant to have. And that's, there's a lot of truth to that because in order to get a body like that, you have to do a lot of unnatural things that are quite unhealthy. And obviously the Silver Era, you can kind of push the envelope a little bit, but to have that like shredded, sculpted physique, you have to do a lot of things. Like you can put on a certain amount of mass and can take a little bit of steroids and not really risk have any adverse health risks or side effects, as far as I can tell. And there are different channels that I've seen. More Plates, More Dates is one of them. Greg Doucette, where you can take a little bit of like anabolic steroids or growth hormone, and so long as you keep it under control and you stick to a relatively low dosage. And there are no poisons, only poisonous doses, right? So you could do a little bit of stuff like that and not really suffer any adverse side effects. Like it's not the same thing as like weed where you can smoke pretty much you can smoke a stupid amount of it. You can't overdose. You can't get addicted. It's the cheapest drug you can buy. But growth hormones and various other forms of like steroids, like tren, and I forget the exact differences between all of those. People will abuse those because they think the more they abuse it, the closer they get to the gods, right? Except it's tied to the Protestant ethic and the ontologies that go along with that. So they'll push it because bigger is better, right? And people will line up to basically see freak shows like that. So the more drugs you take, the thought process, as flawed as it is, they think the more money they'll make, the more respect they'll get, the more pussy they'll get. You know, the sex more broadly, it tends to be heteronormative, so that's why I say pussy. There's, to my knowledge, not a lot of gay bodybuilders because it's a heteronormative sport, just like anything. Chess players, it doesn't have to be a physical sport, but bodybuilding, obviously there's a lot of science that goes into it, but it's mad science, right? And it's, how can I, sculpt my body a particular way? Well, that's not healthy. So, that's another thing I guess I wanted to talk about for further context is that, and this is something that I'll probably take into consideration when critiquing Golden Era Bookworm, is that, I can't imagine them critiquing capitalism too much. I'm just going to go on a limb and say that they won't do that. But that's why people are doing this. It's not just what's happening or how, but why. And the problem is capitalism, by and large. From the 70s into the 80s and beyond, the drug epidemic that is largely affecting non-professional athletes, but also professional athletes. Like he's talking about bodybuilders, and I think he's mostly talking about professional bodybuilders in this particular census, but it's literally just affecting anyone who takes the drug. And you could say, oh, well, they're bodybuilding, but a lot of them are just like they'll probably be in the gym quite a bit. And that idea, okay, you go to the gym to pray. Was it bro science? Reps for Jesus, that kind of thing. It's a joke, right? But he's absolutely on the money as far as that goes. Literally, like, because when they go to the gym, it's the place where you go to pray, and it's very flagellative, right? You're tearing your body down and building it back up. And I'm sure Lyle McDonald would say, oh, it's not just about tearing your body down, and I don't have to get down into the weeds in regards to the science, but you literally go, you flagellate, and you pray to God, and you take your holy medicine, and the idea is you'll get a certain body, and then you'll get a wage, right? So you have to torture yourself to get money so that you can live. And not only are they stealing your labor and years away from your body, but they're also stealing, like, the value of all of that. Like, that you think that you have to do all of this to be able to survive in a system. It's like people aren't doing this because for no reason. More often than not, people that do this kind of thing have a body image problem. It's not just queer people that have gender dysphoria and body dysmorphia, but bigorexia is a form of, body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria, absolutely. And they feel inadequate. They feel like they have to be godly relative to profit to survive. And there is a kernel of truth in that because capitalism has manufactured scarcity. So people feel like, okay, we have to do something to maximize our gains, not just in terms of the muscles, but also what's attached to those, which is money. Because, if a very small group of bodybuilders do make it into Olympus, the fact of the matter is that most bodybuilders don't, and they don't even have anything to show for it at all. They'll be on a lot of gear and not actually look anything like professional bodybuilders. But the point of this video that Golden Era Bookworm is talking about is that even the guys who make it to Olympus die. And they die relatively young. So, that's, a second part of context basically that I wanted to give is what is he talking about specifically if he's not going to critique capitalism, and that's the health of the athletes that are advertising this stuff, because they're not just advertising a particular body image, their sex symbols, their status symbols, but also that it's okay to die, because they're literally martyring themselves, chasing the fire of the gods. It's a Promethean quest. That's not healthy. So yeah, without further ado here, we're going to get started. So I'll exit full screen this, and here we go. Real quick, I think that's Steve Reeves from the Silver Era. Could be wrong.
It's official. Bodybuilders have been dying early since the Golden Era.
I think that's that was the guy before Dorian Yates, I want to say. What was his name? I can't remember off the top of my head. I know he trained Evander Holyfield to bulk up when he went up to heavyweight from cruiserweight. He got drug advice from this guy. I can't remember his name. It doesn't really matter, but this guy was like a 7-time Mr. Olympia, I think, and he basically dominated the 80s. But then after him, Dorian, was the mass monster kind of thing. But this guy was the last athlete before the mass monsters were sort of christened by Dorian in particular. And Dorian was another one of those guys that dominated for like 7 Mr. Olympias, and then after him it was Ronnie Coleman, and after that it was Phil Heath, and I don't know who it is now, but...
Hi everybody, Golden Era Bookworm here, and today I want to...
Sorry to keep interrupting, but so this is the statue of Hercules. I think this is Michelangelo's David, and he has a lot of books here. These almost look like the classics, because the great books of, but these are also book series, and I can't read what they are. Like some of these look like autobiographies and like pop culture type stuff. But a lot of this shit, like these are like vintage looking kind of books, which is kind of cool. It reminds me of like my grandfather's bookshelf, and just like the great books of history, they gave those to me. And they're like, here, you can have these. Here, you can have Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Unities and stuff like that. It's kind of what it looks like, but these could be books. I imagine they're medical volumes, just giving what he studies. But like I said, this guy, you can see like the Roman numerals and the years that these were published and so on and so forth. So they might be medical journals. Could be wrong. But it's kind of cool. It looks like an old professor's bookshelf, which is neat.
Present my recent study that demonstrates that since the Golden...
Okay, so this is a recent study. So again, this is the Golden Paradox: Mortality Trends Across 3 Eras of Bodybuilding from 1900 to 1990. So this is just he's actually not including mass monsters, which is interesting, but I think it kind of goes without saying, because like how much research do you need to do to see that those guys are dying? Because they're dying like super young. They're dying in their like 20s and 30s, and they're so he's just primarily focusing on the golden, silver, and bronze eras, and it's kind of cool because like this is he has an abstract, he has a and I don't know what journal this is published in. Like if he has just like his own, he says it's preprint, so I imagine this is before it's been peer reviewed and stuff like that, and or he's submitting it to different journals. But even so, that's super neat.
Era of bodybuilding.
Yeah, and real quick here, sorry. This is his thesis. However, Golden Era athletes exhibited dramatically reduced lifespans, about 15 and a half years left compared to Silver Era athletes. So about 68.6 years minus. So I guess they're dying more in their 50s or thereabouts compared to the Silver Era, coinciding with the emergence of performing enhancement protocols and extreme physique standards. And that definitely started in the 70s, and then that would explode into the 80s and 90s. and he calls it a precipitous decline in longevity. And that starts in the golden uh, era. He calls it the golden paradox. So the closer you get to the gods, the higher you fly towards the sun, and the Icarian standard. I mean, use your tragic Greek hero of your choice, Achilles, dipping himself in the river Styx, so on and so forth. It leads to, so this is just the beginning of things. So the golden paradox is something that obviously is only exacerbated by the mass monster era, but so far so good. Nothing to really critique.
Athletes have started to die early.
Yep.
I decided to take on this topic of research with my colleague, Dr. Connor Heffernan of Ulster University.
Oops.
My colleague, Dr.
I just want to say, like, his lips are really red. Like, no judgment or anything, but when I was watching this before, I was like, wow.
Connor Heffernan of Ulster University, and in this video, I'm going to show you the results that demonstrate this most concerning fact and worse. Since the introduction of steroids and performance-enhancing drugs into body...
Yeah, I think this particular athlete was, like, going into the golden era. And he did a video on him in particular. I think this was an early casualty of the golden era. Fatalities were definitely less common in the golden era. And you have guys like Franco Colombo. I think he drowned. But he was in his 70s when he died, I want to say. Lou Ferrigno is still around. Arnold Schwarzenegger is still around. And there are different reasons for that. It also has to do with the fact that they made a certain amount of money and they are able to have good health care in the American healthcare system. That's another factor that we'll get into. But this guy died young, if I remember correctly. If it's not him, I like his little undies too. But God, he doesn't have a bit of body hair on him. Though I guess bodybuilders generally don't. They tend to shave their bodies just so you can see their muscle and stuff like that. You don't tend to see bears like Zangief, Red Cyclone. They don't do that in bodybuilding, and they don't have tattoos. Like they have like a very just hairless bodies. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. They don't even have armpit hair, I don't think.
Bodybuilding during the Golden Era, we have seen the physiques of bodybuilding athletes grow ever larger and more impressive into the now modern mass monster era, where we are seeing the deleterious health effects of ever increasing.
Real quick, when I saw this, I just wanted to say that so yeah, they say 6 deaths old school. I don't know the thumbnail, if this is one of his videos. So this must be from the golden era and the silver era. So these are like the people who are really pushing the envelope. And I know there was like one guy in the silver era who was experimenting with anabolic steroids before anyone really knew what they were doing, and he fucked his kidneys up and he like died young. But so this is probably the golden era and the silver era, could be wrong, but and then 29 deaths in the modern era, which I imagine would be from the neoliberal era onwards. So deregulation, personal responsibility, and a Protestant ethic, and everything that goes with that. And I just want to say that the number is actually, from what I understand, higher than 29 deaths. If you're just looking at like the pros or the Olympians, I've heard that it's like 50 or higher, and that's just the pros. And that's not including all of the monetary concerns, because these are drug addicts. So it's not just dying, but comorbidity is including not just things that affect your body directly by injecting drugs, but also, incidentally, being broke or homeless is another comorbidity that just ups your ability to die. So it's not just the acute effects of drug abuse, which is what Golden Era Bookworm is focusing on, but the things that happen from taking drugs that are now illegal and bankrupting yourself. Like, it's a drug addiction, and it's no different than any other drug that you might take and bankrupt yourself, from cocaine or heroin. or fentanyl, I guess these days, if people take that, I don't know, but just any illegal drug, except in this case, it's also tied directly to their body image. That's a form of comorbidity too. Um, I paused this originally though because I wanted to say that Shawn Roden was someone who had a sexual assault case pending against him. So he was someone who sexually assaulted a female bodybuilder, and she had a kit done up at the police station, and he was going to court over that to the point, and he wasn't allowed to attend. And various bodybuilders, were being like innocent until proven guilty, and basically yakety yak yak, allegedly and stuff like that. But it was a pretty serious thing because you don't tend to like. She went to the police station. She had a kit done up. She wasn't just accusing him. Like, she went through the whole process and she was taking him to court, and that kind of thing is, speaking of deleterious, is generally quite harmful to the accusers of the accused. So Shawn Roden is a piece of shit. Like, a lot of people are like, rest in power, rest in peace, that kind of thing. No, fuck that guy. So I just wanted to say that, just neither here nor there. But sorry, my cat was meowing at me. I know, Kitty, Shawn Roden sucks, but that's another comorbidity, right? Is these guys think that they're gods. Like, what's he looking off at? Zeus on Mount Olympus, but they think that they're untouchable too, and which is why they take the drugs, and they think that they're not going to die, or they just don't care. That's another thing too, is they're like apathetic, and it can affect you mentally. These are all comorbidities, so it's not just the physical side effects, which is again what Golden Era Bookworm is focusing on. But I'm being a bit more holistic in terms of my critique.
Performance enhancing drug use and ever increasing physique standards. Bodybuilding as a sport for a long time.
I hate the word sport with bodybuilding because it's like, hey, do you have enough money to take lots of drugs and eat lots of food? Like, that's not a sport. And it's a winner takes all kind of thing, which, to be fair, a lot of competitive sports are, but sports usually have some kind of like physical activity, and bodybuilding technically does. But again, the sport isn't on that. It's how can you like get, like, obviously there's a drug stack, there's how big you can get and how shredded you can get, but it's largely eugenic and relative to material advantage, which tends to favor white cishet men. And obviously there are male athletes, people of color, that also do this kind of thing. And very Hadi Choopan, he's Iranian, and there are a couple of other Mr. Olympias recently, aside from like Phil Heath, who is an American athlete of color, that kind of deviate away from the Nordic model a little bit because they're not white, but they're also expected to be athletes, so they fall into that tokenized standard. But just something to keep in mind is this isn't really a sport because it's like you either have the genetics for it or you don't. So it's like, obviously work is a huge part of it. Like Tom Platz had this really freaky work ethic, and Mike Menser, and a lot of those guys, they work very hard to do what they do. But if you don't have good genetics, then the judges aren't going to care. It's literally phrenology. It's race science, which is fascist.
Has ignored the elephant in the room, as obvious as it has been.
The reason they're doing that is because of profit. It's tied to the profit motive. So they're making money off of these people, off of their deaths, in fact. So not only are the athletes themselves ignoring the negative side effects, which they are, but other people are too. They're addicted to profit as something to chase.
With the media reporting ever earlier deaths of body.
Yeah, Richard Piana dies aged 46, and he did like synthol injections and stuff like that. I mean, look at him, Jesus. Like he seemed like a nice person. Like, he wasn't like a straight up Nazi or anything, but it doesn't matter, man. Like, you're walking billboarding, you're advertising like something that's incredibly unhealthy, and you may as well be a Nazi if you're promoting something to this extreme that people are looking up to you and basically dropping dead. Like, what's the difference, you know?
Bodybuilding personalities and athletes, and most people, including academics, have turned a blind eye to this ever increasing topic of concern.
Yeah, so the idea of the profit motive is something to uphold or support. Academics absolutely aren't immune to that. Like personalities, thought leaders, people. Jordan Peterson, just random example, was an academic who also happens to hate communism. But originally he was a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, but then he became like a paid talking head. And so in academia more broadly, though, a lot of accommodated intellectuals don't strike oil to nearly the same extent that he does, but they're also not as xenophobic and red scary as he is. But even people who are a lot less inclined to betray their class interests and police them also probably don't talk about this nearly enough. And there are reasons for that, like hyperspecialization in academia is kind of a thing, like everyone's atomized.
As obvious as it has been, the first academic to actually address this issue was my friend and colleague, Dr. John.
That is a great smile. Like, he looks so happy. Like, but right off the bat, you know, he has Bill Clinton's hair, but he has like, I don't know, it's like if you took Bill Clinton's head and you replaced it with someone else's face. Like, I don't know. Anyways, I'm not trying to be mean to the guy or anything. And John D. Fair, the tragic history of a bodybuilding icon. And again, right, you have this ancient Greco-Roman sort of hauntology, which is 100% fascist. But then the kind of people who are looking into this are pretty fucking white themselves. Like, and when I say white, I mean like according to like Cartesian thought, heteronormativity, and secular colonialism. You know, so this guy's about as American looking as you can get, or Nordic, and they're like, oh no, it's tragic. Think of Whitey. Whitey died, and it's like, all right, but look at what he represents. You know, it's this particular image, like of the West, is something that's also used to abject other cultures and identities. Like my partner is Mali, for instance, in New Zealand, and they're colonized by people like this. You know, so I'm not going to shed a lot of tears for someone like this. It sucks, you know. I don't want people to like die, but also he died chasing a particular image where he had probably abused his drugs to become a god in a way that, let me guess, ignores a lot of other people who are suffering under the status quo. Just a thought.
Fair, in his seminal book, Mr. America, the
Seminal
Tragic History of a Bodybuilding Icon, Fair actually, he tabulates the lifespans of Mr. America winners between the Silver Era and Golden Era. Here's the page, actually.
All right, so just pausing that real quick. So this is, he says tabulate, so this is more just like a basic kind of list. So, oh wow, yeah. You have different bodybuilders. So basically from 1939, they had synthesized testosterone at this point, but it wasn't until like the mid 50s, I think, when the Silver Era began and they were experimenting with it. So basically the 1960s. You had a lot of guys, you know, living into their 80s, 70s, you know, a couple 60s. One guy died younger from 1958, but that was probably like, I don't know, a congenital thing. But you know, a lot of these guys, and then from the Silver Era, going from 1972, like there's a couple instances here where these guys, yeah, they died young because they were experimenting. Yeah, a lot of these guys, you know, there's a pretty quick decline. Again, in about 15 years, because I think Golden Era Bookworm said there's about a 15-year difference, so it goes from like the 80s to like the 60s, and then even lower than that once you get into the 90s and beyond, where they're dying in like their 40s and 30s even. So yeah, that tracks.
Right there. And in tabulating this data, the lifespan actually of silver and golden era bodybuilders, he points to the fact that bodybuilding lifespans were starting to decrease. This sparked a great deal of interest in me, so I decided to look into this topic in a scientific manner, as I will now explain.
So he says scientific, so I guess the seminal book that he was referring to was more of like a regular history that just happened to have a handy dandy tabulation in it, like a list of just like ages and dates of birth, death, and the numbers. But yeah, I wonder if he gets into his methodology here specifically.
I decided to expand on Dr. Fair's observation and observe the mortality or lifespan of bodybuilding athletes from its very beginning, the Bronze Era, that is from 1900 to 1930.
I don't know if that's Eugene Sandow, but that's basically who that would have been, that kind of individual.
And compare it to the lifespan of bodybuilding athletes in the two subsequent eras, the Silver Era and Golden Era, as I have defined them in the past.
Oh, that looked like the chemist. Crap, I can't remember his name.
And Golden Era as...
what is his name? Shoot. Well, anyways, it doesn't matter. It was competition for Arnold, if I remember correctly.
I have defined them in the past. To ask the question as to whether the lifespan of bodybuilding athletes had been decreasing in the 20th century, I approached lecturer in social sciences of sport at Ulster University, Dr. Connor Heffernan, with my idea, and he loved it. So we decided to collect information on 120 bodybuilding athletes, 40 from each respective era, and report on the mortality of these athletes. Upon performing statistical analysis, we found that athletes from the Bronze and Silver era had similar average lifespans of 75 years and 80 years respectively, with the average lifespan of Silver era bodybuilders being 5 years greater than those of the Bronze era, as can be seen in this figure. Bodybuilders from the Golden era, however, had the lowest average lifespan with 69 years, being 6 years lower than bodybuilders from the Bronze era and 11 years lower than those of the Silver era.
One thing I guess I'll mention here in particular is these athletes were largely American, because these institutions, these bodybuilding institutions, started, like Eugene Sandow was American from what I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these beauty standards and the revival of the Olympics and bodybuilding and that sort of ontological statuesque of the Nordic and Vitruvian model in America that was emulated by Nazi Germany and the Olympics as we know it, was because actually the Olympics were outlawed by the Romans, the towards the end of the Roman Empire, for being pagan, and it wasn't revived until the late 1800s, which incidentally coincides with the rise of American prominence on the global stage. Basically from the 1890s moving forwards, America began to outpace other people globally, or to compete with them, and from World War I and World War II, they basically found themselves on top. And with that, coinciding with the Bronze Era was basically between World War I, the interwar period, and World War II was the Bronze Era, and then the Silver Era was after World War II, and then the Golden Era was from Bretton Woods into the neoliberal era of the West, specifically America. And so these numbers that you're seeing coincide with athletes that lived in an area of the world that, while it went through a depression and multiple world wars, Um, that doesn't change the fact that these particular athletes were largely exempt from, I don't know, getting bombs dropped on them unless they specifically went to fight overseas. America was largely spared from the deleterious effects of World War I and World War II at home. Yes, there was a Great Depression, but it wasn't so great that it caused fascism to erupt the same degree that it did in Nazi Germany. And then you had the Marshall Plan and various treaties where they sold materials to Germany after the war, and there were various things. They defaulted on various loans after the Treaty of Versailles and leading into the market bubble and of the 1920s, and that bubble burst, and then there was the Great Depression in America. There was another depression in Germany, and the depression in Germany, they defaulted on all their loans from America after the Treaty of Versailles, and it led to the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 30s, and then all of the stuff that happened during World War II, and the American war economy and the war effort, and just all of that economic stuff was something that America profited off of. And then the rise of the CIA and Zionism and all of the things that led to neo-colonizing the global South and Middle East, and all of the atrocities that happened in Cambodia, Vietnam, and various other parts of Asia and Southeast Asia, and Russia, and the Cold War, and just all of these things. The reason I'm mentioning all of that is because in the West, after World War II and leading up, World War One, basically the entirety of the 20th century, the West had a higher life expectancy than other areas in the world, because other areas in the world were getting bombed and destroyed by America, that was dealing weapons, lend-lease, right, and selling guns to both sides and bombs and all that kind of great stuff. So, this idea that, oh, well, look at these athletes, they're so healthy. Well, I'll tell you one simple trick that doctors hate. It's not getting bombs dropped on you and having your home blown up and being starved to death by Western sanctions or having dictators installed by the CIA. There's all kind of shit like that has nothing to do with fucking drugs. Like, obviously, Golden Era Bookworm's not going to mention any of that, but it's just something to keep in mind. When you look at these numbers, you're like, wow, And now what's going to start happening is, in chasing that Nordic model, American athletes are going to start dying faster and faster, but also America is in the decline as a nation and is falling into fascism. So we're going the way of Nazi Germany. So these numbers are going to go down, not just because of drug use, but also for all of the various comorbidities that I just described. The chickens, as Malcolm X once said, are coming home to roost. So that sucks. And that, unfortunately, doesn't have anything to do with the study, except, like, it is going to affect athletes, regardless if you're on gear or not. You could be as natural as you want to be, and if you don't have food to eat or a house or money to survive under capital, then you'll reap the whirlwind, because that's what capital does. If you don't have money, you die. That's it. You don't get to eat. It's like there's no UBI in the American system, and the American healthcare system is a fucking joke. And, there's Trump and all of that shit that's going on. A bit of Nazi stuff going on too. So something to keep in mind.
We performed further statistical analysis using t-tests, which allowed the comparison of each era and determined whether they are statistically different or not, and revealed the following. There was no statistical difference in the lifespan between Bronze Era athletes and Silver Era athletes. However, there was a statistical difference between Bronze Era athletes and Golden Era athletes.
So I want to say real quick, this is all Greek to me. Like, I'm like, okay, average. That's about it. I don't know what SD is. I don't know all these numbers and shit. It's like, whatever, sure, I'll take your word for it.
The greatest statistical difference was observed between Silver Era athletes and Golden Era athletes. These results indicate that, when compared to the Golden Era, a greater lifespan was achieved by athletes from both the Bronze and Silver Era, with athletes from the Silver Era achieving the greatest lifespan from all three eras.
Now, I will say he's going to attribute this to like, oh, bodybuilding and health. Well, yeah, and if you're not at war and you can do all of that stuff, then yes, wow, you get to live longer. But these are also privileged men, that access to good health care at a time in American history, the 1950s and 60s, where it was an incredibly privileged time in a privileged part of the world that was reaping the rewards of having basically taken advantage of all of these other people who had died elsewhere in the world, like, I don't know, Soviet Russia, and the stupid amount of people that died during Lebensraum, and the Nazi invasion of Russia. Like, there's all kinds of stuff like that. So there are a lot of other reasons why they're living longer. It's not just drugs. Though I will say that, yes, acute drug use has an acute negative effect. And that's the point of Golden Era bodybuilding. And I'm not trying to discredit anything that he's saying here. I'm just saying, as a part of my critique of what he's going on about, it's also worth mentioning that the Silver Era guys lived the longest because they were at a point in history where the healthcare system in the United States and just access to various standards of employment and housing and food and various other things were better than, say, in the 1920s and 30s in terms of modern medicine and the FDA and various other things, on top of the fact that they weren't abusing anabolic steroids. So I could say that the extra 5 years that they had on top of the guys before them was because of all of that, not just the drugs. But the moment that you introduced the drugs in a nation that was still relatively well-to-do in terms of everything, and neoliberalism hadn't really started to happen yet in the 1970s, but even by the 1970s, you had, bam, an acute drop, like of 15 years on average, which is huge, just because of the drugs. So the 1970s, I think it's actually pretty smart to focus on that era, because after that, neoliberalism starts to do all kinds of fucked up stuff, and it fucks with unions and healthcare systems and taking away people's basic human rights, their access to a lot of these things that otherwise would have helped bodybuilders live as long as the Silver Era guys. So I think focusing on the Golden Era, like from the 1970s in particular, is a smart move.
Indicating that the Silver Era bodybuilding athletes had the greatest longevity. Now, I previously presented preliminary data on this analysis a couple of months ago, and it really is no surprise that Bronze Era and Silver Era bodybuilding athletes, which were all likely natural and at least not dependent on performance-enhancing drugs, displayed greater lifespans, decreased mortality, and increased longevity. And I do wish to expand on the reasons and factors why we believe this is so a little later, as obvious as they are, because they are worth discussing.
So I wonder if he'll go into some of the comorbidities that I mentioned, or just the various variables, if he's just going to focus on drug use, or if he's going to mention some of these other factors. Because, anytime you're looking at people's health, you have to take into account material and social conditions, like war or famine, the Malthusian factors, basically, eugenics, fascism. These are things that will kill you just as fast as drugs. And maybe not, well, depending on exactly what happens. They drop a bomb on you, or you get, I don't know, sent to a concentration camp, which is happening right now in America. And not just to marginalized peoples, but also various enemies of the state overall. Yeah, so there's stuff like that I wonder if he'll mention any of that.
However, when I first presented preliminary data on this topic, some comments I actually received suggested that we compare the life expectancy of the general population at the time to the lifespan of bodybuilding athletes from the Bronze Era, Silver Era, and Golden Era, which was a great suggestion that both Connor and I had also thought about, so we did. So looking at this table, we divided the calculated mean value of lifespan of bodybuilders from each era with the mean life expectancy of the population taken from world or Western populations.
So they look at world and Western populations, right? So you got Europe, right? And there's a point in time, like if you look at the world population, and there's a pretty steep decline in Asia and the world more broadly, like after the 1950s. And gee, I wonder, would it have something to do with the Korean War and Vietnam and the bombings in Cambodia? Like, and, so there's various things where you can see, like, geopolitically, there's just, I don't know, a genocide going on, or two, or three. And so, like, Western powers were doing all these really fucked up things where you have this steep, decrease in health, but in the West you had this rise from like the 1950s and 60s, like this vampire capitalism, right? Where Marx from Capital, capital is dead labor sucking like the vampire on living labor, and that's what's happening here. Where you have the West sucking from a position of advantage after the World Wars, with from a position of advantage, and they're you can see them feeding, moving money through nature, right, and doing that, and in the world more broadly, but also Asia and Africa. There isn't even like a census for, like, obviously the West was interested in itself and measuring that. You don't even have a census for Africa until like the 1930s, it looks like, or thereabouts. But then, the life expectancy is just lower for Africa and lower in Asia and lower in the world than what is this? The Americas and Europe and Oceania. So these guys up here are sitting pretty, and everyone else is just kind of lower because of like the way that the West treats its geopolitical enemies, which is to say the people it exploits. So there's all kinds of reasons for this. It's not just like, oh wow, we did physical fitness and oh yeah, we're doing so good. Well, what side of the fence are you on, basically?
Which were sourced online. To ensure compatibility, the year 1860 was chosen as the birth year corresponding to Bronze Era athletes. 1900 was the year chosen as the birth year corresponding to the Silver Era athletes, and 1950 was chosen as the year for Golden Era athletes. Bronze Era athletes had a life expectancy at least twofold higher than the average life expectancy of the general population in the West, and up to 2.5 times greater life expectancy than the rest of the world.
Okay, so like the rest of the world and the West, so they lived higher than the rest of the world because the rest of the world was being preyed upon by the West. So there's that. But even within the West, so just sticking within their own, within the Imperial Core, Bronze Era athletes tended to live longer vis-a-vis the year 1860. They lived twice as long for various reasons. And a lot of that has to do with medicine and stuff like that, I imagine. And then 1990, I'm not sure if I'm reading these charts right, but there's definitely signs of longevity in terms of like the medians and the averages, and But the Bronze Era guys and the Silver Era guys and the Golden Era guys and they just tended to live longer across the board relative to these older years from 1860 to the 1900s and the 1950s. And it's pretty interesting. It's like, okay, twice as long, almost twice as long, and twice as long, almost twice as long, so on and so forth. So by the time you got to the 1950s, all of the effects that they were doing through the physical fitness were offset by all of the drugs and things that they were doing to sculpt their bodies. Like it's almost like a form of surgical addiction at that point. So like the Bronze Era guys tended to live longer, but also the people around them tended to live not as long, even within the Imperial Core. But then by the Silver Era, when that averaged out a bit, they still lived nearly twice as long. But they're also a member of they're like upper middle class to upper class athletes. These were elite athletes. So that comes with like petit bourgeois to bourgeois privileges. So I would say that factors into it as much as the drugs. But one thing you can't ignore is the Golden Era guys. It didn't matter if they were privileged or not. Like the class benefits that they had were neutralized and in fact reversed by them taking the drugs. So it's actually pretty useful, even with the Marxist stuff not included, and he's not addressing any of that. I can still look at his data and be like, oh yeah, no, this is totally, it speaks for itself.
Silver Era athletes had a life expectancy of 1.7-fold higher than the average life expectancy of Western populations, and at least 2.5-fold greater life expectancy than the world population. Golden Era athletes, however, had a similar life expectancy to Western populations, 1.2 to 1-fold, which is pretty much the same, but a higher life expectancy when compared to the rest of the world's population's life expectancy.
For the reasons that I've outlined, it's not just like, oh, well, they didn't have as good of gyms in these other countries. No, they were getting like bombed and napalmed, and having nuclear bombs dropped on them, various other, and invaded, or having dictators installed. Like the CIA tends to lower people's life expectancy so they can destabilize the region, which raises criminogenic conditions, and comorbidity as a whole rises regardless of drug use. In America, the irony is people are dying because they get addicted to drugs, which tends to happen in America.
From the data we have presented, it is obvious that athletes from the Bronze and Silver Era displayed the greatest longevity, especially when we compare their lifespans to the population averages of each respective era of the 19th century. And it is rather unfortunate to observe that this almost protective or even life-enhancing effect, if you wish to call it that, I definitely do, which doubled one's lifespan, was significantly diminished during the Golden Era.
Again, all of the benefits of having access to good health care and training and all of that, reaping the benefits of living within the Imperial Core in a time of Pax Deorum, Pax Americana, is offset by these drug addictions. It's the capital does that. It alienates people. It makes people want to chase things relative to, you can't just be happy with normal, and they try and chase greatness relative to, body dysmorphia is a huge part of it. Wanting to be like, it's a form of assimilation fantasy, basically. And that has some pretty negative health effects. You look at someone like Donald Trump, he doesn't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but people think that the body image through the assimilation fantasy leads to these negative effects, equivalent to taking cocaine or heroin or fentanyl. It's pretty fucking disastrous, especially when you start compounding things like diuretics and synthol and tren and various other things.
By half, which coincides with the adoption of performance-enhancing drugs and increasing physique standards, When I look at this data, it is almost depressing. It appears
Almost? It's like, no, it is depressing. It's a fucking tragedy. It's like, white supremacists talk about white genocide. You want to know who's genociding white people? Themselves, through a drug addiction and various other things, but drug addiction by and large, and adopting like fascist mentalities. You think they're doing this just because they're like, you know what, I feel like taking some anabolic growth hormones today. No, they're doing it because they're catering to the Nordic model, which leads to them dying.
is that natural bodybuilding as a sport peaked at least in longevity, in health, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and produced the greatest lifespan and longevity in these athletes.
Not just that, though. It also has to do with the fact that you're talking about people living in from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but I would argue that people who survived the Great Depression, and I wouldn't include people that went overseas, because obviously that's going to have a drastically negative effect on one's life. Getting parachute dropped into occupied territories overseas, or storming the beaches of Normandy. That's not good for your health. So, but just focusing on people at home that basically lived relatively privileged existences for their times, yeah, of course they're going to be relatively healthy, especially because they were living within the Imperial Core. No shit.
Increasing their life expectancy to twice as high as the general population.
But you see, so there's like a rise and fall. It's like capitalism totally made these people live longer until it entered decay, and then they started dying. So athletes dying because of drug abuse, chasing the Nordic model, is a form of capital in decay. You can't just be happy with a specific limit, partly because they're chasing the profit motive. And neoliberalism makes things scarcer and deregulates the market, but also deregulates what you can take. And it all compounds and exacerbates. There's a lot more than just the drugs.
The practices at the time were likely influenced by their predecessors, the pioneers of the Bronze Era, who practiced physical culture using basic gym equipment such as dumbbells, barbells, chest expanders, as well as gymnastics equipment. As Bronze Era athletes were truly all-round athletes concerned in the cultivation.
That's pretty cool. They're very like holistic athletes, but again, like this is tied to like Western supremacy, and Western supremacy was something that was carried over into America from other countries. Now, obviously, like Western values basically manifest destiny in America, and various thinkers that from Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers moving forwards took this idea of Western supremacy out of antiquity. And, you saw it in Napoleon's France and various other countries that were dominating the world at the time. White supremacy. This guy looks like that kind of Nordic model. This was all done to basically prove that the West was superior to other places. And this Golden Era Bookworm guy isn't really critiquing any of that. It's like, wow, they just tended to live longer, man. Well, yeah, but why were they doing that? Like, or why were they touting all this? Why were they celebrating it? It's like, the West is so good, man. Capitalism is so cool, but also genocide's cool. Because how do you think America was founded? As a nation that currently exists, an empire. So there's a lot of stuff like that that's tied to the rise and fall of not just families. Okay, go away. My cat just entered the room. Go away, kitty. Yeah, I know. These bodybuilders are dumb. Yeah.
Of their health and the strength of the body. Having said that, Bronze Era athletes did not have the luxury of modern medicine or understanding of nutrition.
The paradox, though, with all of that is that having the luxury of modern medicine and nutrition is that they also didn't have things that you could abuse, because there's no poisonous There are no poisons, only poisonous doses. That includes nutrition and taking pills and powders and things like that. Anything that you take into your body, show me what you eat and I will tell you what you are.
Yet on average, lived longer lives than their Golden Era contemporaries, some 30 years later.
Yep, because, again, the capital began to decay even before the neoliberal period officially started in the 1970s. Well, and even then, neoliberalism started in the early 70s with the oil crisis and developing things in Chile, installing a dictator there, and basically testing neoliberalism in small before taking it to America in 1980-81 with Ronald Reagan, and in 1980 in Great Britain with Margaret Thatcher.
With double the life expectancy. So these Bronze Era athletes, I mean, these guys, they definitely knew what they were doing, and they were definitely doing something right.
They were also privileged, something to keep in mind.
Silver Era bodybuilders focused on the cultivation and development of health, strength, and vitality, as was so clearly worded on the pages of muscle mags from the time. Silver Era athletes trained full body routines consisting of dumbbell and barbell movements with almost no machines.
God, they look like Nazis. Like, I don't know. And like the beauty standards and the aesthetic sort of qualities of it look very like Nazi training camp kind of thing. Like, oh, and they're all like, yeah, we're all flexing and oh, we'll get bitches, you know, and they all look like trad wives. Valkyrie, choosers of the slain, right? I'll slay you, take you to Valhalla, you know, and
used at the time. Very few were invented back then. They focused on whole food diets, and very few supplements were used, and of those that were available, these were mostly based on food extracts.
Well, also the idea of whole foods, and the processing of food, and the injecting of, yet again, relative to the profit motive, and steroids weren't just used on people, but they were also used in animals, and the expanding of the meat markets in ways where they were to grow more and more meat for people to eat and take into their bodies so that they could get as big as they are. They grow these chemically enhanced cattle and other like poultry, and just any animal on earth that you could think of is biologically enhanced through drugs. So it's like the Frankenstein effect doesn't just affect people, but nature and chattel more broadly. And then people in turn are chattelized in ways that see them dying prematurely, just like the animals that they're eating.
Such as desiccated liver, wheat germ oil, and bee pollen. Protein supplements at the time were in their infancy and mostly consisted of soy, egg, or milk concentrates.
Okay, and that's all good and great and everything. And these guys look relatively statuesque and okay, neat, good, great. That's all very interesting. But it's also, again, tied to people who are very privileged, people who are tied to a supremacist model that would begin to decay, and with it, and with the onset and the abuse of modern science and medicine affecting everything around them, it would begin to affect them in terms of what they were taking into themselves. And like there was the sweet spot, you know, but capitalists couldn't leave well enough alone, and they just had to have more and more and more, and it begins to infect, well, they're human billboards, basically, because that's what these guys are. They're symbols of Western values and supremacy in ways that would begin suitably enough to decay.
Further, Silver Era athletes focused on developing a balanced and aesthetically pleasing physique, and most were not concerned in being as big as humanly possible. The physique standards at the time also required much less definition that was displayed later on in the Golden Era, allowing them to not sink to such low body.
And real quick, just like the vacuum poses and stuff like that, like these are very healthy individuals, like physically. Like it's not like if you look at someone from today, even if they were of a similar size to this, if they're on a huge drug stack but they look basically like this, and they can still do like a vacuum pose and stuff like that, they could be incredibly unhealthy just in terms of the drugs that they're taking. These guys aren't really on drugs. I mean, they might be on a little bit, but certainly not dependent on it. And having like that smaller drug stack I was talking about, like that Greg Doucette mentioned, or Lyle McDonald, where you take just enough, that's kind of what this is.
Fat percentages, which are detrimental to human health. All these factors likely lead to the long lifespan, double that of the lifespan of the general population that they were able to achieve.
Well, and again, though, these guys are privileged athletes. Like, they have people filming them. They have, like, starlets and actresses around them. Like, these aren't just anyone. Like, there's a class character to these health effects within the Imperial Core. So there's all kinds of reasons why they're living as long as they are. Like, these aren't just anyone. You know, that's the trickle-down kind of mentality. You think everyone in America lived that long? Like, and you could argue that maybe it ties to the media and more broadly, but again, you know, data and stuff like that doesn't tend to account for homeless people, people not on the census, people being abjected, marginalized communities, and police violence. It's a police state. So if you look like the status quo, statuesque model for said police state, of course you're going to live longer.
And understand also that the Bronze and Silver Era athletes, these guys had to go through depression, famine, and even world wars.
Yeah, I'm a little leery of that. Like, yeah, they had to go through all of that, but, okay, they're not bulletproof. And, you know, the guys who lived as long as they did. Now, it is true that a lot of guys served in World War II in particular. After that, as far as, you know, beyond the greatest generation and serving in World War II, and then Korea, and then in Asia and Vietnam, and various proxy wars, basically, where American allies intervened and all of that. Like, these aren't Supermen. You know, they're not superheroes, and to say, oh well, they lived through all of this. Yeah, but these were privileged guys, and they could and if they did serve in the military, they could very easily have died. You know, they didn't survive because of their good physical fitness alone. You know, it's like, yeah, you can mention it, but if they served in the military, they could have gotten shot or blown up, and it wouldn't matter how physically fit they were.
Yet they still had greater lifespan than those athletes of the Golden Era. The results from our paper have several implications for the contemporary and modern practice of fitness and bodybuilding. There is no doubt that the culture of fitness has a positive effect on our health and lifespan. We as people have known this for thousands of years.
He says, okay, physical fitness is something that's good for people, but again, it's tied to cultural values that benefit a specific subset of people in a hierarchy that's built on racial privilege and supremacy. And not only that, it's sexist, so it excludes women categorically and forces them to be broodmares for the state. Like, that ancient Athenian problem and the canonical laws basically extending into capital as it exists presently, and even in the 1950s and 60s. Like, so it's like, there are all these things that you're not mentioning. You should mention them.
However, the specific modern practices that appeared during the latter part of the 19th century have demonstrated to be detrimental to the health and lifespan of athletes, increasing their mortality. This trend, of course, should raise concerns over the current state of bodybuilding and the competitive standards that are currently enforced on competitive physique athletes. It does suggest that competition organizers may need to reconsider the criteria in judging and reintegrate better health and wellness aspects into the standards.
Okay, and I just want to say, like, look, dude, I love, one, you're being so polite. You're being like, oh, it does suggest, and I think maybe it's a good idea. And I'd be like, no, dudes, they're fucking dying. These are workers. If you're lobbying for workers and being like, and unionizing, like as far as worker action goes, this is pretty flaccid. You want to be like fucking upfront about this and vocal and be like, no, they're fucking dying, and the reason they're dying is because they're incentivized by capital to die, like just full stop. And you're appealing to people. You may as well be appealing to Immortan Joe in Fury Road and saying, "Can I have some more water, my lord?" And that's like they're going to be like, "No, keep taking the drugs." They're encouraging it because they're money makers, and the men who run the show want them to keep doing it. So they don't want their athletes to be healthy. It's a bread and circus. Being a gladiator is not healthy. And it's like the point of this is not health, it's for profit, it's for control. Even before capital existed, the way that we think of or conceptualize it in Rome, for instance, and city-states, like it was an older form of capital, but it was like a pre-feudalistic ancient imperial form that was based on slave labor and early forms of industry. It was still like there was still a profit motive. It was largely through conquest and slave labor. But these athletes exist to make rich people money. Joe Whiter's Olympia, and Joe Whiter was fascist. So yeah, like you're appealing to people who are, and you're being like, oh, please, just think of the athletes. And they're like, no, we want them to do this because it makes us money. Like it's the Vince McMahon thing.
To enhance the well-being and health of its participating athletes.
Look at him too. He's like, I look so cool. Look at my mustache. I'm a mustached muscle guy. And I never liked the tan and the veins, the vascularity and stuff like that. It's like, yay, I have high blood pressure. Yippee. Like he's like not very healthy right now. Like he's at his unhealthiest, and this is like a completely fucked view of fitness. Like it's bullshit, and it's just very masturbatory, and like it's one thing to be like those Silver Era guys. If we could get rid of the white supremacist aspects of that and just have the bodies and the shapeliness of it, but even then it's like the Vitruvian model is problematic because it excludes other bodies that are pear-shaped or don't have an hourglass shape, because all of those bodies, this industry doesn't care about those. It cares about a particular eugenicist approach to things that is tied to white supremacy and fascism and capital more broadly. So even if this guy was a Silver Era dude, I would still want to deviate away from it and say that, okay, I want health for everyone, not just a particular statuesque that gets to reap the rewards within the Imperial Core. We need to distribute this away from these gluttons. And, it's bring about communism. Communism will solve all of these problems. Trust me, it'll be a post-scarcity world. There will be no more war and various other things that are super unhealthy. There will be no drug epidemics. People can still get addicted. Sexual assault can happen. Murders can happen. Various physical violence can still happen. But it just won't be tied to criminogenic conditions and systemic issues. It'll be more individualized, thus less prone to happen at large overall.
Athletes. Further, it is also important to address the impact of social media on the culture of fitness.
Yep.
With the advent of social media.
Yeah, so this is a completely valid point. Like this guy's like 20, 21, and it's just like, no, this is not healthy, dude. Sam Sulek, what are you doing?
Yeah, our exposure to the physiques displaying single-digit body fat percentages, extreme muscle mass, and worse, illegal recreational drug use practices have normalized these practices to the point that expectations have led to increasing body dysmorphia.
Yeah, and all of this, but that started where do you think this started, dude? That did not start in the Golden Era. That started with Eugene Sandow and the imaginary antiquity tied to the force of will. If you can just work harder through a Protestant ethic and be, fash, or at least fash adjacent, then you'll conquer death. And so that started with the Bronze Era. Like, again, so it's like you can't just say the Bronze Era, just because they didn't take drugs doesn't mean that they weren't promoting things that were ultimately unhealthy, which capitalism is. And its entire belief system tied to a very particular body type, which is intensely problematic because it polices and abjects everything else.
People are simply not content with the cultivation of health and longevity anymore. And instead of
Who's your audience, by the way? What do you mean when you say people? Like white cishet men? Like there are plenty of people who are super physically healthy, and they don't look anything like those statues that you have in the background, like Hercules there or David. I just want to say real quick that the funny fact about uh, antiquity is that they actually valued smaller genitals. So if you had a giant horsecock, you would actually get shamed for it. It's just, I don't know. If you look at the statues, they'll have these tiny little uh, penises that you could hide behind like a leaf uh, because that was seen as virtuous. And it's kind of funny, just like if you take drug use, it can actually shrink your genitals, from what I understand. So I don't know, just kind of vibing with that weird sort of facet or fossil of antiquity.
focusing on improving themselves and comparing themselves. The temptation to compare.
Yeah, and that idea of comparing is once again tied to the bronze and silver guys. Like it got progressively worse. And you could look at the silver era and say, okay, there's the just balance. Well, they can't hold that balance because the capital doesn't do that. But it's also tied to a belief system before that that was inevitably going to progress further and further into the golden era. It's just historically, materially, that's how it played out.
Ourselves to extreme physiques and adopt dangerous drug use has led to the proliferation of these practices that are likely, as history has shown, to be more damaging than beneficial to our health and mental state.
Yes, and not just history, but historically, materially, according to socio-material factors. All of this is being caused by capital and bodies endemic and representative of capital. It's just like you're talking about the drug use and its role in things, which is pretty illuminating. It's a good study, but you need to be a little bit more holistic in terms of like, okay, what do the bodies represent? Like you have all these statues and these Western values and all of this, but you're not really. There's needs more Marxism.
So I hope you have enjoyed this video on my first academic bodybuilding publication.
Hey, congrats. Okay, so it's actually published. That's cool. Um, that's pretty interesting. But again, it's academic and it suffers that kind of myopic approach that academia has, where you're like, drug use and you need to think about the drugs, and I'm like, yeah, but you also need to include the holistic socio-material factors and just the belief system attached to it. People don't just take drugs arbitrarily. They do it because of particular values that they're trying to embrace and furthermore embody and sculpt relative to their bodies. They represent a particular body image that capital uses to advertise profit and Western supremacy and all of that.
On this most important and interesting topic, and if you have enjoyed this video and discussion, please like the video, subscribe, and as concerning as this topic is, I invite you to comment in the comment section. I am of course very interested in hearing your feedback, so if you're interested in reading this paper, it is available for free. It is open access. Just click the web link in the description below. Please find the PDF link on the web page. You actually have to click on the PDF link there, and you can download the PDF for free to read. Would love to hear your feedback. I will be following up this publication with several others, and I will be updating you on those in the coming months. That's it from me. This is the Golden Era Bookworm saying bye for now. Head to www.goldenerabookworm.com.
Okay, so neat. How I developed broad shoulders, Reeves ribcage and full body routine. How I developed my waist. Like, that's all good and great and everything. And you know, Steve Reeves, you know, has a pretty nice physique. If everyone looked like Steve Reeves, the world would actually be a pretty awful place, because I think body diversity is really important. So andro and gyno diversity and a lot of things that he doesn't represent, because he's basically a human poster for heteronormativity, but also just again, a Vitruvian standard that alienates people from everything else. You know, it's like people are constantly chasing this one particular statuesque standard and basically ignoring everything else. Where do you think body dysmorphia comes from, and eating disorders and psychological disorders? It's from trying to force people to look one particular way. Diversity is strength. Over specialized, you breed in weakness. Heinlein should have followed his own advice. But in any event, yeah, no, this is a neat video. I liked it mostly, and a lot of these critiques have more to do just with what Golden Era Bookworm leaves out of his study. But all in all, I thought, you know, the study itself was something that I could work with. I could be like, oh yeah, no, it's like, okay, here everyone's, you know, healthy, good, you know, a lot of privileged people within America leading up to, you know, basically from the World War II into the post-war period, and assuming these guys don't have military service, and if they do, then you should absolutely not include them in the study, because they're being subjected to all of these things, or they're going to die young potentially. But so the data set seemed good, and again, it's relatively small just because you're looking at privileged athletes, but because they're like specialized and they represent a small privileged group of the population, I think you can get by with a smaller number, because you're representing a smaller privileged group of, you know, the American populace overall. So yeah, no, that was all, you know, super good. Needs more Marxism and stuff like that, but I'm going to say that about most people, because, you know, most people that study bodybuilding tend to be, you know, status quo dudes, you know, white cishet men by and large for the most part. But yeah, overall, I thought it was cool. Um, I don't think I'm gonna look at the study right now, just because I saw like little. Well, I'm kind of curious now. So just like, okay, so I'm not seeing it here. The link, but it doesn't matter. I think you get the point. I could always look at the study another time, but yeah, the video was good, and those are my thoughts on it. This is just something I'm doing for fun. It was late at night, and I just needed something to talk about for a few hours before bed. I'm gonna sign off for now, though. I'll probably do, you know, videos like this in the future, just when I'm not talking about like my Metroidvania series. I do like talking about physical fitness and the male body image and the Nordic model and just stuff like that, and critiquing people that study that, because we need to critique each other and our allies, or our potential allies, especially in times of crisis when you're dealing with, you know, Nazis and fascism and stuff like that. Because you have someone who's like, oh, la-di-da, look at me, I'm so fancy, and it's February 10th, 2025, and I'm doing this particular study, but I'm not mentioning fascism at all in my video. It's like, dude, we're in the middle of like a crisis, and this is what you're doing. You should use your channel to talk about some of that stuff too. Just a thought about Palestine, about trans rights, you know, instead of just, oh, well, think of white people. Think of gentrified middle class white people who are upper middle class, or even just upper class white people who have eating disorders and starve themselves to death and drop dead because they make really stupid decisions tied to an outmoded model of, you know, bad lifestyle choices tied to imperium and capital. Okay, like, but you know, that's outside the scope of his study, it seems like. It shouldn't be, but it is. But yeah, so there you go. If you like the video, let me know. Golden Era Bookworm, no disrespect, man. You know, by and large, I think that you do good work. You know, obviously you could be a little bit more holistic, but I think that's true of most people. Yeah, so If you liked it, leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe, and all of that. And I'll see you in the next video, whenever that is.